our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's Unspun. Here in the USA, it's back to school time. I sent a teenager off to school myself today, and since the summer is over for me, it's time to get back to the basics on the podcast. So, in this episode, we're going to go back to starting with a warm-up, where I'll give you some examples of real things from the news that show some logic or thinking issues I think you ought to know about. Then after that, we're going to hear from the journalist who uncovered a true and very interesting story about voter fraud here in my home state of North Carolina. Sound good? Let's get unspun. But before we get going, I wanted to throw out a thanks to Elizabeth P., who took the time to share her thoughts on some specifics about an episode that we did recently. She made a great suggestion, and I think I'm going to be using that for a social media post soon. I really do appreciate it when I hear from you guys, whether that's in the comments on a podcast review, or whether you write to me at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I do write back, and I'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's get on with things. Have you ever heard a parent tell their child to do something because I said so, or because I'm your mother? Maybe it was your parent, and it annoyed the heck out of you. It's not a very convincing argument. It's an example of what we call an appeal to authority. I've talked about this on an earlier episode, but to review, an appeal to authority is when someone tries to support their argument by citing an authority figure rather than by providing, evidence or reasoning. And they're basically saying that because this person says it's true, it must be. And here's the thing. It's not wrong to refer to experts, but it can become a problem when the authority isn't actually an expert in the relevant field, or when they might be an expert, but they also might have an agenda. Let's look at a couple of examples to make this clearer. Imagine you see a commercial where a famous basketball player is endorsing a new energy drink. The player says, "I drink Supercharge before every game. It's the best way to boost your energy and improve your performance." Well, think about that for a moment. Is a basketball player necessarily an expert on nutrition or on the effects of energy drinks? While the player might actually enjoy the drink, their expertise is in basketball, not in nutrition or biochemistry, and they're likely being paid to endorse the product, so their words are probably biased. This is an appeal to authority, because it relies on the player's fame and success in basketball to persuade you about something not actually related. And since we're just past the Olympics, I'll say this is the same thing that happens when you put an athlete on the Wheaties box. Let's consider another example from the medical field. During the COVID-19 pandemic, you might have heard people cite various public figures' opinions on treatments or preventive measures. And in some cases, they were even actually doctors. Here's what the New York Times wrote in the obituary of Dr. Vladimir Zelenko. Quote, "Until early 2020, Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, who is also known by his Hebrew name Zev, spent his days caring for patients in and around Kiryas Yoel, a village of about 35,000 Hasidic Jews roughly an hour northwest of New York City. Like many healthcare providers, he scrambled when the coronavirus began to appear in his community. Within weeks, he had landed on what he insisted was an effective cure, a 3-drug cocktail of the antimalarial drug hydroxychloroquine, the antibiotic azithromycin, and zinc sulfate. Now, he was not the first physician to promote hydroxychloroquine, but he began to draw national attention on March 21st, 2 days after President Donald J. Trump first mentioned the drug in a press briefing, when Dr. Zelenko posted a video to YouTube and Facebook in which he claimed a 100% success rate with the treatment, and he implored Mr. Trump to adopt it. A day later, Mark Meadows, Mr. Trump's chief of staff, reached out to Dr. Zelenko for more information, and so did talk show bookers. Over the next week, Dr. Zelenko made the rounds on conservative media, speaking on podcasts hosted by Steve Bannon and Rudolph W. Giuliani. Sean Hannity of Fox News touted his research during an interview with Vice President Mike Pence. End of quote. Now, Zelenko was a doctor, but was he the right expert for the media to be quoting? His findings from his treatment were interesting and worth testing. But worth testing doesn't mean tested, and running a big scientific clinical trial is not the typical training for a doctor. Before we break this down, what questions might you ask yourself when you hear a claim like this? Here are some things to consider. Is this a scientist studying COVID? What evidence are they basing their claim on? Have reputable health organizations or peer-reviewed studies supported what they say? In this case, unless the person has the relevant medical expertise and is basing their statement on solid scientific evidence, their opinions on COVID treatments aren't more valuable than anybody else's. And this is another example of an appeal to authority, where someone's fame or influence in one area is being used to land weight to their opinions in an unrelated field. Now let's listen to some real-world examples of appeals to authority and think about why they might be a problem. First, we'll go back to 1994. The CEOs of 7 major tobacco companies testified in front of Congress about the addictive nature of nicotine. Here's a clip from the testimony.
Let me ask you first, I'd like to just go down the row, whether each of you believes that nicotine is not addictive. I heard virtually all of you touch on it. Just yes or no. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no. And again, time is short. If you can just, I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
What's wrong with listening to these executives? Surely they know a lot about their products. Well, while these executives were certainly authorities in the tobacco industry, they weren't medical experts or addiction specialists. But more importantly, they had a clear conflict of interest. Their company's profits depended on people continuing to buy their products, so they had a strong incentive to downplay the addictive nature. And this is a case where the authorities not only lacked the relevant expertise, but also had a reason to be dishonest. Let's move on to a more recent example. In 2002, many cryptocurrency companies used celebrity endorsements to promote their products. Here's Matt Damon in an ad for Crypto.com.
History is filled with almosts, with those who almost adventured, who almost achieved, but ultimately, for them it proved to be too much. Then there are others, the ones who embrace the moment and commit. And in these moments of truth, these men and women, these mere mortals, just like me, as they peer over the edge, they calm their minds and steel their nerves. The 4 simple words that have been whispered by the intrepid since the time of the Romans. Fortune favors the brave.
Now, the ad doesn't explicitly say buy cryptocurrency, but the images show viewers that they should invest in crypto. However, Matt Damon is an actor, not a financial expert or an economist. His fame and likability are being used to make cryptocurrency seem like a good investment without providing any actual evidence or analysis. So finally, let's consider an example from education policy. In 2005, President George W. Bush defended his No Child Left Behind policy, which emphasized standardized testing. Here's what he said.
I also strongly believe that we want to make sure the No Child Left Behind Act continues to work. You measure every day. That's why you're successful business people. I mean, you know what your business is doing. I believe we ought to extend that same principle to our public schools and ask a simple question. Can a child read at grade level? And in order to determine that, that's why you measure. And if the answer is yes, we all say, great. If the answer is no, the question, then what are you going to do about it? And so the principle behind the No Child Left Behind Act is to set high standards, believe every child can learn, and measure to see if we're getting results.
Now, at first glance, this might seem reasonable, but let's think about it a little more deeply. What assumptions is he making about the relationship between testing and learning? While the president does have access to a bunch of experts, he himself isn't an education specialist. His statement oversimplifies a really complex issue, and in fact, many education experts argue that excessive testing actually hurts learning. The incentives get teachers to teach to the test, and it kind of narrows the curriculum, and it really stresses out the students and the teachers. So this appeal to the president's authority argues the nuanced debates in the field of education. It's really important, though, to note that just because someone isn't a good authority on a topic doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. You know, the tobacco executives could have chosen to tell the truth about nicotine's addictiveness, for example. And measuring outcomes in education isn't, necessarily a bad idea. The problem is using these people's authority or status as the main reason to believe their claims, rather than looking at the evidence and the arguments. So, when is it okay to rely on authority? Well, it's often appropriate when the person is a genuine expert in the right field, and experts in that field agree with each other, and it's important that the expert doesn't have any conflicts of interest. Appeals to authority can show up in different forms. So, for example, on the social media platform X, formerly Twitter, users can now buy a blue check verification mark. It used to show that Twitter had verified the account belonged to a person of public interest, but now it just shows that someone is paid. And this causes confusion about who's actually an authority. So remember, it's okay to consider expert opinions, but it's also important to think critically and look for supporting evidence. So don't just let someone's status or authority prevent you from asking questions. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll hear from a local TV journalist about how what they call shoe leather reporting helped him uncover a voting fraud scandal. I'll be right back. Welcome back. In 2018, a small-town election scandal rocked North Carolina and really made national headlines, and it was a tale of ambition and deception and the fragility of the whole democratic process. The story starts in North Carolina's 9th Congressional District, a slice of the state that hasn't elected a Democrat to Congress since 1963. The gerrymandered district stretches from the suburbs of Charlotte to rural counties all along the South Carolina border, encompassing a real mix of urban and rural voters, including rural Bladen County. In the Republican primary in that district, Mark Harris, an evangelical minister and no relation to the U.S. presidential candidate, had narrowly defeated incumbent Robert Pittenger. Harris then faced Democrat Dan McCready, a veteran and businessman, in the general election held on November 6th of 2018. And as the votes were tallied on election night, the race was too close to call. The next day, with Harris leading by about 2,000 votes, McCready conceded, but this was far from the end of the story. As the final votes were counted, Mark Harris's lead shrank to just 905 votes out of nearly 283,000 that were cast. It was the closest the district had seen in over 60 years. But something didn't seem right. The North Carolina Board of Elections refused to certify the results. They had gotten reports about irregularities with absentee ballots, particularly in rural Bladen County. At the center of these allegations was a man named McCrae Dallas, a campaign operative with a criminal record who had been hired by the Mark Harris campaign. Dallas had a history of handling absentee ballots in suspicious ways, dating back to at least 2016. And as investigators dug deeper, a really disturbing picture emerged. Witnesses told local news stories of Dallas and his team collecting unsealed absentee ballots, falsifying signatures, and even filling in blank votes to favor Republicans. And the scale was kind of staggering. It's believed that there were more than 1,000 ballots that might have been tampered with or destroyed. The fraud appeared to target elderly African Americans in particular, raising concerns about discrimination. And the political fallout was pretty quick. McCready withdrew his concession. The Associated Press restricted its call of the race. And the seat stayed empty when the new Congress convened in January. But the story wasn't over. In February, the State Board of Elections held a dramatic public hearing, and over 4 days, witnesses testified about the scheme. But the most explosive testimony came from an unexpected source, Mark Harris's own son. John Harris, who was himself a federal prosecutor, told the board that he had warned his father about Dallas, and email records backed up his claim, and it was just a stunning moment that seemed to contradict Mark Harris's testimony. And the next day, in a tearful statement, Mark Harris admitted to making false claims, and he called for a new election, and the board unanimously agreed, setting the stage for a special election later that year. The aftermath was really broad. McCrae Dallas and several associates were indicted on felony charges, and there were investigations by state and federal authorities, and actually changes in North Carolina's election laws. Mark Harris, citing health concerns, decided not to run in the special election, and in the end, Republican Dan Bishop stepped in, narrowly defeating Dan McCready in September of 2019. But the story doesn't end there. In a real surprising turn of events, Mark Harris announced in 2024 he would again run for Congress, this time in North Carolina's newly drawn 8th District. And he won that primary in March in what local media dubbed a comeback bid, and he's actually on the ballot this fall. This is a reminder of the vulnerabilities in the electoral system and the challenges to maintaining the integrity of democracy. But to help us unpack this story, we're joined today by Joe Bruno, who works for WSOC-TV in Charlotte, North Carolina. Joe's reporting uncovered a lot of the specifics of the story, and he's won several awards for his coverage of this election. Joe, welcome to UnSpun. And I would love to start by asking you kind of what skills you think are essential for someone who wants to be a successful TV journalist.
Yeah, I think the most important skill, believe it or not, is writing. And people don't really put two and two together because they just assume you're reading a teleprompter, but that's not really the case. There's a lot of writing that goes into this job. It's my favorite part of the job, is actually composing the scripts and stories that I read on air. Another big part of this job is just being inquisitive and being interested in things, asking questions, wondering why things are the way they are, and poking around in areas that maybe other people aren't taking a look at. It could be something, it doesn't have to be large stories. It could be just a city council meeting, going to that and asking why they are voting the way they are. So I think writing and really just being curious are two of the main interests that you should have if you want to be a journalist.
Could you walk me through what a typical day looks like for you?
Yeah, there's really no typical day, but I'll just say that my shift either starts at 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. It will always start with an editorial meeting where we will pitch stories that we want to cover, and we will hear about what is going on around town that day that maybe we will cover if we have time, or maybe they will assign me to that story instead of one of the ones I'm pitching. On Mondays and Tuesdays, I typically cover a meeting, and the meetings start at 5 o'clock. And I will, in between that time, get my ducks in a row, make sure my photographer that I'm working with has all the video, and we'll prepare for the story in that way. I'll attend the meeting, I'll interview elected officials afterward, and I will put together a story that night for the 10 and 11 o'clock newscasts. On a 9 to 6 day, we'll start the day with the meeting again. The only difference is sometimes I will be live at noon on the story, and then again at 5 and 6 o'clock. In between, when I'm not working on the story, I'm actively producing my political show. So that means I am writing content for my show that will air on Sunday. So there's kind of always something going on for me, and I'm always working on some story in some form or fashion.
Okay. So are investigative pieces different than kind of the standard news reports, your day-to-day kind of things that you do?
The biggest difference, I would say, is time, because they give us more time to work on the investigative stories, and they want them to be longer and more comprehensive. So for a typical story on a day turn, it would be about 1 minute and 15. That's how long the story would be. Investigative stories can be longer, usually around 3 minutes, bare minimum, but sometimes we see that they can be even longer than that. When you have investigative stories, they want you to have more perspectives, whereas a day turn, you might only talk to 1 or 2 people. And in general, investigative stories are usually harder than day turns. They take more research and legwork.
Yeah. Are there more people involved in investigative pieces?
Usually, yes, because on a day turn, it is really just you and your photographer and the producer. For investigative pieces, it is those same 3 people plus an investigative producer. And depending on the story topic, you may have the news director or even legal take a look at your scripts.
So what does an investigative producer do?
Investigative producer does a lot of behind-the-scenes work. They are sort of like a professional Facebook stalker in a way, because sometimes they're doing background checks on people to find out what their stories are or where they live, so we can knock on their door and contact them or get their email addresses. They're also the ones who are reaching out to agencies constantly looking for information or filing records requests. And, one of the more fun parts of their job is if we ever need to go undercover, they're usually the person who is the undercover person because we know that they won't be recognized as easily as, say, an on-air person.
Oh, really interesting. So speaking of going around and knocking on doors, I'd love to talk to you about a specific piece. And that's your award-winning coverage on the North Carolina congressional race from 2018. So I'd love to know what initially kind of drew your interest in that story, especially since it was so far from where you actually work in Charlotte.
Absolutely. So back then, the 9th Congressional District stretched from Bladen County, which is about 3 hours from Charlotte, all the way to about the South Park Mall, which is in Charlotte. So it was a very gerrymandered district. So there was a Charlotte tie. It's just the controversy was very far away from Charlotte and wouldn't normally attract a Charlotte reporter. But since there was just that little Charlotte tie and both candidates were from our area, we decided to take a look at this. It was a very expensive race for the U.S. House between Mark Harris and Dan McCready. It was a very tight race. And after election night, it looked like Mark Harris had been the winner. We all just said congrats. We moved on with our lives. But it wasn't until a few weeks later, the State Board of Elections refused to certify the race. That's when everyone kind of started asking, what is going on here? This is unusual.
Yeah. Can you walk me through the process of how you and your crew kind of started investigating the story? So what was the first thing you did?
The first thing I did was call the campaigns to see if they had any idea what was going on, and the answer was no. So I was like, okay, this is definitely unusual. And, I was reporting on that race pretty extensively. So I had gotten to know a lot of people throughout the 9th District, and I had different people I could call about different topics. And the more we poked around, the more we realized that, there is something sketchy here. And a source provided me with affidavits that had been filed with the Board of Elections that really went into some of the irregularities in this contest. And that was our first look at why the State Board of Elections refused to certify the race. Because when they refused to certify it, they didn't really just go out and say, this happened, this happened, this happened. We really didn't have any idea. We knew this never happens, but we didn't know why, what they had their eyes on. And so throughout that week, we were able to get a better idea of what exactly was going on and being looked at in Bladen County. But the biggest thing we did that gave us a leg up on all the other reporters is that we were down in Bladen County first. So we were the ones who were really going after this story hard. We knocked on doors. We just talked to random people in town. They all generally knew why we were there or what the certain players, if we could ask about names or things. And we were able to land the story just by talking to people and knocking on doors and asking, hey, what happened here?
So what does it feel like to go up to someone's door and kind of be prepared to ask them those kind of questions?
Most of the time, the worst thing they'll do is just shut the door and slam the door in your face. Or, very rarely is it a situation where they will, pull a gun or send the dogs out to you. It's kind of just like you're knocking on a neighbor's door and you have a false level of confidence and you just go in there with a prayer and hope that it works out. And in this case, it did many times. I mean, there were plenty of doors, people who didn't answer, plenty of people who told us to go away. But for the most part, we were friendly. They saw that we had the camera there and we told them what we were doing, what we were asking about. And people opened up and told us what they knew. I mean, the other key fact is, or key thing to remember is, at that time, this was just like a way of life down in Bladen County because there's just been so many issues with their elections in the past and sketchy things happening. So the crux of the story was people were going around and picking up absentee ballots, which is illegal. But a lot of the people I interviewed said this has been going on for years. Well, you had no idea. What are you talking about? It's illegal. So when I talked to them, it was kind of a surprise to them to learn this is what all of this was about. And they didn't necessarily feel like they were doing anything wrong by talking to me because this has been their life for all the elections, essentially.
Yeah. So, was it hard to gain people's trust to talk to you?
Not really. As the story developed, in those initial stages, it wasn't really partisan because people just wanted to know what was going on. And, as time went on, some people on, Mark Harris's side were initially distant to me because of the stuff that I had found in reporting. But now all of that's kind of water under the bridge. Eventually, they realized that I was just doing my job and they were doing theirs. But and aside from the ringleader of the whole scandal, McCrae Dallas, everyone else was, for the most part, pretty open with me and willing to talk to me.
Okay. And so what kind of steps do you go through to verify information when you get it by doing something like knocking on someone's door?
Yeah, a lot of this was hard because we were kind of learning as we go. Like, a source provided us with the absentee ballot covers of the votes by mail during this race. And they showed a pattern of people who were signing as witnesses, which is very weird because if you think about it, if you fill out an absentee ballot and you need two people to witness it, most of the time you're going to ask your neighbor or like your spouse, kid. You're not going to ask the same people over and over and over again in all different parts of the county. So when we got our hands on these documents from the source, we had to first call other experts and be like, are you seeing what we're seeing here? Like, is this a red flag to you? Because it certainly seems like a red flag to us. And that was one way we verified the information. From there, it was kind of just a lot of telling the story through the perspective of the people that we were interviewing. We knock on the door. She tells us that she went around and picked up ballots. She signed as witnesses, picked up ballots. That we know she was signing as a witness because we see her name on the paperwork here. She tells us she was picking up ballots. We know that the investigation is over absentee ballot fraud. All of those things together gives you confidence in the story, especially when you're attributing her doing the action because that's what she told you. So it was definitely a stressful time in terms of fact checking when we knew that our story would instantly blow up. But I'm glad that we took the extra time to make sure everything was accurate. We took the time to make the calls to other people who could look over our documents and make sure everything was correct as well. And it all worked out.
Yeah. And so does some of that verification involve, other people at the station?
Absolutely. There at least 3 other people laid their eyes on that script before I voiced it to air that night. And it's important that that happens. And it's important, really, that there's always a second set of eyes on all of our work, even if it is just a city council meeting, because a small mistake can become a large problem. And especially when the world is watching for a story like the 9th Congressional District fraud.
Yeah. Okay, great. Do you think this case reveals anything about kind of the vulnerabilities in the broader election system? You had to drive 3 hours to go down and get this story, and there's not a whole lot of views who are going out and doing that, right?
Yeah. This part of this problem was it's a news desert for the most part. There's only, I think there's a weekly newspaper in this county, and I don't know exactly their news gathering or their staff or their ability to cover things like this during that time period. As far as election security goes, I think this really did shine a light on a vulnerability for North Carolina, because back then, if you requested an absentee ballot, the state put your address, your name, your party, all online. So anybody could go online and see Joe Bruno requested an absentee ballot at so-and-so address in Charlotte. And that allowed the campaigns to, something as innocent as send you a mailer about their candidate because they knew you were definitely going to vote because you had that ballot, or something as harmful as sending somebody to your door to pick up the ballot, which is illegal. Now, North Carolina doesn't do that. They do not disclose that you have received a mail ballot until after you have returned it. So that the ability for you to ballot harvest is gone now, essentially. And so that was a major security enhancement that election officials put in place as a result of this. And there hasn't been any issues with ballot harvesting since.
Okay. And so, that's a really practical implication of your story. I'm wondering, since the story did get a lot of attention kind of nationally and then won several awards later, what has that meant for you personally?
Yeah, I really appreciate the feedback and the recognition that the story has received. I think it's given a little bit of more credibility to my reports. I know that certainly people turn to me now for anything North Carolina election related, and I try my best to cover it fairly and accurately and as comprehensively as possible while just being me. But I love North Carolina politics, and I love focusing on Charlotte in particular. And it has been a great ride. I really enjoy this, and I'm grateful that my story helped drive this conversation.
Fantastic. I always ask at the end, is there anything I should have asked you and I didn't?
No, this is great. I mean, just a couple years later now, Dan McCready, he ran for that seat again in the do-over election against Dan Bishop. He lost. Dan Bishop now, of course, is running for Attorney General in North Carolina. Mark Harris ran for the seat again, and the district's slightly different, but it was in the March 2024 primary. He earned 30.8% of the vote, which was the most in that race amongst all the candidates. The threshold for a second election is 30%, so that 30.8% or so that he earned was enough for him to win the primary. It is a Republican-favored district, so he will likely be heading to Congress now 6 years later.
Awesome. All right. Well, Joe Bruno, thank you so much for joining us on UnSpun, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.